Hello everyone, sorry for the delay. I cannot for the life of me find my glasses anywhere, so hopefully that's not going to be too much of a hindrance. Guarantee they're going to pop up right in front of me at some point. But yeah, for the time being, this is sort of a proof of concept stream, so we'll see how this goes. If this is painfully boring, we'll do something else in future. But the general idea here is It's just going to be kind of not super high stress or high energy, because, you know, I'm not high energy generally. Sort of a research stream. So we're going to be looking at something that I actually haven't read before. And I'm just going to be analyzing it, comparing it with other books. I've got several documents open in front of me at the moment. A few relevant things by Rousseau, the Cambridge editions in particular. And of course, what we're going to be focusing on primarily today, which is this horribly low resolution edition of Joseph de Maistre's Against Rousseau. So we'll go through that. I don't know how far we'll go, but it won't just be like a straight read through. What I'll probably do is I'll read through it, and we'll go down some detours, and we'll go on tangents and whatnot. And because this is just sort of like a more chill research stream, if you guys want me to look at anything while this is going on, feel free to recommend things. By the way, what the hell is everyone talking about with this dewormer? What? Anyways, I'm in Canada, we don't have worms here. So yeah, so we'll just go through this for however long that goes. I'll probably read it as I go, and we'll go from there. Where the hell are my glasses? I'm literally the only one here. Nobody took them away. That'll be useful. Anyway, that is frustrating. Alas. Alright, let's go. Enough of this. Against Rousseau on the state of nature and on quote-unquote, that's interesting, it's on quote. Oh, I see, it's two sections. On the state of nature and on the sovereignty of the people. So I think we're going to be primarily focusing on the state of nature, but we'll see. We might jump around quite a bit. Just to take a look at what I'm looking at here. I have the Cambridge Companion to Rousseau open for some reason, but I have again, oh, this is de Maistre again. Where's Rousseau? Did I not open those? Okay, so we have the discourses in there. I've got some stuff open up. God knows what it is, but we'll just get into this guy. Against Rousseau. Should probably plug this in so I can see what you guys are saying without having to close the screen constantly. That will get frustrating. All right. So I mean, here, let's open this up. Right off the bat, obviously I'm anticipating a lot of disagreement with Rousseau. Not with Rousseau. I do have disagreement with Rousseau, but a lot of disagreement with de Maistre. So, again, I'm going into this blind. I'm going to try to be as objective or as charitable. Or, we're not going to be reading this with the aim of deconstructing it or like in the negative sense or sort of rebutting it. We're going to be just trying to understand it for the most part. Now, that might involve noting some areas where he gets something wrong, or he says something kind of questionable, but that's not going to be the primary focus. If that happens, that'll be incidental. Hopefully. We'll see. And I have no notion going in as to what decent translations are, because as far as I can tell, there aren't really many translations of de Maistre. There's the Cambridge edition of his Reflections on the French Revolution, or it's called something along those lines. And then there's this one by McGill. So, and this is all I could find. I'm sure there's other things that exist, but for the time being, this is what we're working with. So we have on the state of nature. Interesting. So man is sociable in his essence. That actually sounds very Rousseauian. That's kind of interesting. Man born evil is a part of his essence. That's not Rousseauian. And then on the origins of sovereignty, on the sovereignty of the people, the origin of society, of sovereignty in general, particular sovereignties and nations. Oh, that's interesting. A lot of especially social contract theorists and theorists of sovereignty don't tend to focus on, I guess, what we would call the international. Now, this is still saying of particular sovereignties and nations. That may just be taking some historical examples. But, you could actually derive like a field of competing, or a field of play in which there are multiple sovereignties taking parts. That could be interesting. Examination of some of Rousseau's ideas on the legislature. We're probably going to go through a lot of this later on. I think we're primarily going to be looking at the state of nature, so we might actually jump ahead depending on where that goes. But yeah. So the first section is on the state of nature. That's about 34 pages. We'll probably end at about there. We'll see how far we get. Alright, the introduction. I'll probably read that after. You know, I don't have anything by McGill, but it seems like they're just sort of superficially looking at it, it seems like they have a lot of the same features as Cambridge does. Cambridge is sort of the standard. Alright, on the state of nature, here we go. Chapter 1, man is sociable in his essence. There's a footnote. This chapter doesn't appear in de Maistre's manuscript. It was added by the editor. Okay. So in 1755, the Academy of Dijon proposed the following question. What is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? It is quite evident that this question is poorly posed, for every child knows that it is society that has produced the inequality of conditions. Moreover, what is natural law? This is a different question. Okay. So the question that must be asked is, what is the origin of society? And is man social by his nature? This question, however, resembles so many others that academies set perfunctorily that they do not remember the next day, and that was perhaps not even read to them by their secretary. Whatever the case, Rousseau laid hold of this subject as made expressly for him. Everything that was obscure, everything that exhibited no specific meaning. Am I audible, by the way? Let me know if I'm being too quiet. Volume is good? I know a few people complain about the audio on my streams being very low. I listened to them afterwards and it doesn't seem that bad, so I think it might just be some of you have your volume very low. If there's a bit of a discrepancy between the volume of the intro music, maybe that needs to be fixed. But we'll continue. Whatever the case, Rousseau laid hold of this subject as made expressly for him. Everything that was obscure, everything that exhibited no specific meaning, anything that lent itself to rambling and to equivocation was his particular domain. Well, that's rude. So he brought forth his discourse on the origin of inequality among men, which caused such a sensation at the time, like every paradox supported by an eloquent man, especially if he lives in France and if he's in fashion. De Maistre was not French, he was Sardinian, I believe. When we examine the work coldly, however, we are astonished by only one... He did speak French, though. We are astonished by only one thing, which is... Actually, I want to make sure... Let me double check that. I don't want to... I hate when I realize that something I'm saying I've heard anecdotally. De Maistre, Sardinian. Yeah, Sardinian. Yeah. Yep, Sardinian. He was not French. He did speak French. When we examine the work coldly, however, we are astonished by only one thing, which is to know how it was possible to build a volume on such a narrow base. Not only is the substance of the question only skimmed, there is not an idea that really pertains to the subject that is not a commonplace. In short, this is a reply made in a delirium to a question posed in sleep. After an endlessly long and comic dedicatory epistle, Rousseau gets to the question. The Academy had asked, what is the origin of inequality? That's one. And two, is it authorized by natural law? Rousseau reverses the order, but he is careful not to reply directly. If he had treated the question that had been asked, his genius would have been frustrated. In fact, he took the negative side, so that the first part of his work, instead of being philosophical, is purely historical. Right. So in the sense of being a denial of natural law, hence historical. He supposes that nature, this is his great machine, created man in an animal state, and instead of proving this, he amuses himself by describing this state, which for him is the primitive state, or the state of nature. For such a description, only poetry is needed. He gets carried away on this point and writes 94 pages before he even thinks of proving what he has advanced. I mean, yeah, so this is... So just for clarification, this is a more or less accurate characterization of what Rousseau does, if you like really reduce what the Maistre is saying here. But Rousseau is pretty explicit at the beginning. Let us set aside the facts. He's effectively doing something. He's continuing what Hobbes did. Basically, he's conjecturing as to how beings such as us now, what developments must have occurred for us to get to here. Taking for granted that many of our characteristics are consistent between then and now, and Rousseau is a little bit more radical than Hobbes in that he actually removes quite a few of our features, which is where he's often falsely characterized as sort of ennobling pre-societal human beings to an absurd degree, which he does to an extent, but not nearly as much as he's accused of. The second part of the work, which has only 90 pages, begins on page 95. Rousseau starts with a celebrated statement: "The first person who, having fenced off a piece of ground, took it into his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society." However, this statement is only a statement, for the general idea of property is much older than territorial property, and society is much older than agriculture. Okay, we need to be really careful with what we understand here by society, because if we think of society in the modern sense, if we aren't using this as colloquially with community, then this makes no sense. Why? Because because when we're talking about sort of the domain of the social as apart from sort of other domains, we are again assuming some kind of fixity such that you can have sort of an unfolding complexity of like social strata, where there is more than just the community moving from place to place. So when he talks here of the savage possesses his hut, his bed, his dogs, his hunting and fishing tools, etc., just as we possess our lands and castles. No, we possess our lands and castles in a very different way than somebody possesses a hut or a bed or dogs or hunting and fishing tools. The nature of property ownership is radically different, especially in antiquity. Well, maybe not especially in antiquity, but it's definitely more pronounced in that there is explicitly religious significance attached to property ownership and to the divisions between territorial property. And I mean, for God's sake, even when you look at the word we translate as law, when we look at how the ancient Greeks, arranged their society, they took the word literally from the dividing hedge or trench or wall or whatever that separated one property for another, nomos. And you even have political, which is a term we go back to as a way to describe the structure of a particular kind of community. Following on from Schmidt, but sort of subterraneanly consistent with political theory, going all the way back to Plato. Going all the way back to Heraclitus, really. The Kalmyk Tartar, the desert Arab, has ideas of property as clear as the European. He has his sovereigns, his magistrates, his laws, and his cult, and yet he does not judge it appropriate to fence off a piece of ground and say, "This is mine," because it suits him to be continually changing places. The idea of a nomadic people excludes that of agriculture. Okay, fine. I don't think Rousseau's talking about a nomadic people, though. I'm going to have to revisit it. It's been a long time since I read the discourses. 5 years, actually. But I don't think Rousseau is talking about inequality in the sense of one person being ahead and one person not being ahead. I think he's talking about inequality in the sense of specifically things like riches and the capacity to exert force because of your accumulation of resources. And that would absolutely be determined by your capacity, again, to fence off and defend a territory. Whereas in a nomadic society, obviously that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but I mean, we're not talking about a political community in that case. Because again, like to return to what we were talking about in the stream on the origin of the state, the polis, or the political, literally comes from the word for a fortress, a fixed defensive structure on land. So it's I mean, it's even in the word nomadic, right? So he's not being. I don't think this statement is ridiculous, but I don't think it really touches what Rousseau is doing. And we can go endlessly on this. Like, he has his ideas of property as clear as the European. He has his sovereigns, his magistrates, his laws. No, he doesn't. What's happening is we're looking at a very low level of resolution at these communities and trying to say, well, what best sort of matches the criteria just at a superficial level of a magistrate or of property or of sovereigns, and finding that. But sovereignty is a bit more of an interesting question, because that concept has an interesting evolution. But same with laws. Like, this just takes so much for granted. Like, he's not wrong at like a low level of resolution, but when you pick this apart, when you're actually careful with what you're saying, this is a very weak statement. One might think that the author is making a distinction between civilization and the establishment of society, that in the passage cited he only means to speak of the first. Civilization, the established. It is true that Rousseau, who expresses himself clearly on nothing, can create this doubt by using the equivocal term civil society, but the expression is sufficiently explained by what follows. But it is very likely that by then things... Okay, this is a quote. So, quote, "But it is very likely that by then things had already come to the point where they could no longer remain as they were, for this idea of property, depending on many prior ideas, which could only have arisen successively, was not conceived all at once in the human mind. It was necessary to make much progress, to acquire much industry and enlightenment, and to transmit and augment them from age to age, before arriving at this last stage of the state of nature. The general idea of property, although it had required many centuries to be born, was therefore the last stage of the state of nature. So in the passage cited, it is simply a question of the establishment of society, since it is a question of the state that immediately follows the last moment of the state of nature. This is an equivocation between society and the state, and that's a mistake. Again, I think he's using society sort of equivalent to... I think you could almost equate it with just community. But not even community. Community works. So there's sort of a lack of there's an inability to kind of break down these categories more specifically so far. It is not necessary, therefore, to say that society was produced by the first man who decided to enclose a field, since it evidently existed before this act. Therefore, Rousseau not only establishes a synchronism between the enclosure of the first field and the establishment of society, he supposes one between this establishment and the general idea of property. In truth, I do not think he perceived what he had done. He had not thought about his subject enough for this supposition to have seemed improbable. What is he saying here exactly? So what the Maistre does is he characterizes again the establishment of a political community, or of a state, or of community simply, as the establishment of society. So, it is not necessary, therefore, to say that society was produced by the first man who decided to enclose a field, since it evidently existed before this act. I don't see how that's evident. Yeah, I don't see how that's evident. Like when we're talking about like these many centuries, much it was necessary to make much progress, to acquire much industry and enlightenment, and to transmit and augment them from age to age before arriving at this last stage of the state of nature. Like mobile communities, like nomads, have technology, right? There are different. They even do limited amounts of agriculture sometimes. So I don't see a contradiction here. Obviously, you need to have a viable means of living off land in order to leave off of hunting and moving around, and that would take a certain level of technical sophistication. You wouldn't just do that arbitrarily. So I don't think this is a strong critique of Rousseau. Let's see what you guys have to say. Where's my phone? Oh, there it is. Let's take a look. About time I checked up on you. Maybe you're all gone. Interesting how we can see the similarities and differences between society and state in this context from the last video. De Maistre is famously really catty even by the standard of philosophical rivalries. Yeah, I would agree with that so far. He's living up to the reputation. Nope. Yeah, so we'll keep going. Yeah. Alright. After this general assertion given as an axiom, Rousseau enters into the details to show how, by what imperceptible gradations, the inequality of conditions was established among men. Here are the truths he reveals to men. Although man in the state of nature had scarcely more intercourse with his fellows than with other animals, nevertheless, by comparing himself with these bipeds, and especially with his female, he made the important discovery that their way of thinking and feeling conformed entirely with his own. He joined with them in a herd to take a deer, for example, or for similar reasons. Soon they found hard and sharp stones to cut wood and dig the earth. Weary of the shelter their tree or a cave had furnished, they made huts from branches, which they later decided to daub with clay and mud. This was the epic of a first revolution. Sorry, this was the epic of a... What is that bracket doing there? This was the epic of a first resolution which produced the establishment and differentiation of families, and which introduced a sort of property. Is that a quote? Yes, it is. Okay. Right. Okay. Men in this state enjoyed a great deal of leisure, which they employed to furnish themselves with several kinds of commodities unknown to their fathers, and this was the first yoke and the first source of evils. They began to draw closer to each other. Men who had coupled quite simply for centuries, and who had found this quite good, decided to love. He was punished for this corruption by jealousy, and blood flowed. Happily, they began to sing and dance in front of their cabins and around the trees, but there was another misfortune. The handsomest, the strongest, and the most adroit, or the most eloquent, became the most highly considered, and that was the first step towards inequality, and at the same time towards vice. In this state, however, men lived free, healthy, good, and happy insofar as they could be according to their nature. But from the moment one man needed the help of another, as soon as they observed that it was useful for a single person to have provisions for two, equality, already attacked by the aristocracy of singers, dancers, and the beautiful, disappeared and property was introduced. This great revolution was produced by metallurgy and agriculture, which ruined the human race. ... Let me find the actual full quote here. This is 349. Oh, there's no notation on this version. Damn. Yeah, screw it. We'll come back to that later. I have my Cambridge edition coming in tomorrow, actually, which is why I decided to do this. Because I've been using the Hackett edition for the longest time, which is typically assigned in undergraduate classes because it contains both the discourses and the social contract, and the Cambridge edition, which is better, only has, it's in 2 volumes. One has the social contract, and one has sort of the earlier writings, including the discourses. So it's a money-saving thing. Things having reached this point, it is easy to imagine the rest. Unquote, and the story is ended. In total, 30 pages to answer the first question, which he made the second. Is that against natural law? Now, he characterizes it as the ruin of the human race, talking about Rousseau. And he characterizes it as vice and evil, but I don't see any reference to natural law. If anything, like when we talk about natural law, there are different things that we could be talking about. In the context of social contract theory, we're not really talking about the same thing as when we're like looking at scholastic ideas of natural law. We're looking at things like natural rights. And natural rights in Hobbes and in that whole trajectory, they have very little to do with rights in the legal sense. They have to do effectively, you can think of them this way. At what point are you demanding of someone, at what point are you working so much against a person's interests that you can no longer demand compliance from them? So like a natural right is to life, and it's not because there's some magical principle that says you must allow other people to live. In fact, you have a natural right in Hobbes, in State of Nature at least, to everybody else's lives as you see fit. However, they have a natural right to defend themselves at all costs. You can't order someone's you can't, for example, like order someone's suicide. Or, I mean, you can make the locution, but that by itself has no force, because at the point where your law is resulting in the death or the misery of a subject, you've already lost any normative hold you could have over them, because they no longer benefit from the law. What's this $800? What are we talking about here? Weird. Anyways. Oh, I see. I have no idea what you guys are talking about. Did the term natural rights exist then? Yeah, it existed in Hobbes. Hobbes is quite a bit older than Rousseau. Rousseau responds to him. John Locke, by contrast, doesn't. Although there was an essay posted on the Discord where they apparently uncovered some kind of correspondence that indicated that Locke was actually quite conversant with Hobbes, and I don't think anybody doubts that he was conversant with Hobbes. Okay. This is followed by another work in which he treats the origin of government and the social pact. He recapitulates, however, and he assigns 3 distinct epochs to the progress of inequality. The establishment of the law and of the right of property was, he says, the first stage. However, the aristocracy of beauty, of skill, etc. was the first step towards inequality and towards vice. And the sharp stones, the huts of branches, etc., also brought about the first revolution, producing the first yoke, and was the source of evils. This is evils in the plural, and this is referring to just generally disadvantageous or unpleasant things. This isn't invoking sort of like a cosmic Manichaean evil or like a sin or something like that. And was a source of evils that have since overwhelmed the human race, from which it follows that inequality had 3 first stages, which is very curious. The second was the establishment of magistracy, or if you prefer, metallurgy and agriculture. Oh, that's interesting. I'm blanking on this. So an equivocation between magistracy and metallurgy and agriculture. We're going to do another stream soon, once we do the Machiavelli stream, where we're going to go through Rousseau, and that's going to be interesting. Or if you prefer metallurgy and agriculture, you may choose. I see, okay. Oh, okay, I see what he's saying. So, I'm not going to hunt for this in the Rousseau, but as a second stage, so the what appears to be sort of amusing to de Maistre is that Rousseau is perhaps waffling between characterizing the second stage as being the establishment of magistracy or the establishment of metallurgy and agriculture. And so it's like, well, which one is it? Pick one. Well, I mean, it's both, right? If you have complex industries that require land and defense and distribution, and the transportation of resources, in other words, like just complex industry, then you need magistracy. You need people in charge of managing those relations and keeping everybody in line, and yada yada yada. Yeah, magistracy. I can't speak. Magistracy is the techno-elite. That's exactly right, Pippa. Thus, inequality had 3 first epochs and 2 second epochs. What an analysis! What profundity! What clarity! Yeah, this is that's a little bit like you're getting a little riled up there, Jojo. What Rousseau should have taught us, at least approximately, is the duration of the first epoch, where men had laws, but not a magistracy, which only appeared in the second epoch. Yeah, there's not an issue there. Again, the source of law is fixed relations between units, and the most primitive units of those would have been territorial. Insofar as we are talking about relations that can be abstracted away from the concretes, you can have like a system of law. You can codify these relations as rules and entitlements and things like that. You need fixity of property and whatnot, but you don't necessarily need a magistracy for that. You could, for example, have different tribes in federation with each other, which is indeed what was the case in Athens for a long time. Kraut actually uses a resource that goes into this in depth when you look at Fustel de Collage's The Ancient City, which sort of does a genealogy of things like law. It's a very good book. I highly recommend it. And it's actually, it's not boring at all. Like, it sounds kind of dry, like what is the subtitle? A study on the religion, laws, and institutions of Greece and Rome. It sounds like it'd be sort of tedious and technical. It's extremely, it's got almost like a Dark Souls lore kind of tone to it. It's kind of epic, actually. Here Rousseau pushes distraction to the point of... Oh wait, no, sorry, I missed one. The third epoch is unique, but quite remarkable. The third and last was the changing of legitimate power into arbitrary power. Here Rousseau pushes distraction to the point of confusing the progress of the human species in general with the progress of particular nations. He considers the entire human species as a single nation, and he shows it raising itself successively from animality to the cabin, from the cabin to laws and property, from laws to metallurgy or magistracy, and from legitimate government to despotism. from which it follows incontestably that the subjects of the antique sovereigns of Asia, those monarch gods whose wills were oracles, were much better governed than the Spartans or the Romans at the time of Cincinnatus, since they were nearer the origins of things. Or that the Spartans and other republicans of later times did not have a legitimate government because they arrived after the third epoch. The third epoch. The changing of legitimate... Okay, so we need to be very careful again about what we mean by legitimate power. So, the distinction in antiquity between... Like, let's say in Athens and Sparta and whatnot, the distinction between a king and a tyrant. We use the word tyrant sort of synonymously with bad guy in power, right? It doesn't matter if they're there as the by right of law or by right of birth, yada yada yada. What matters is, does he promote freedom or does he hinder freedom? Or is he cruel, or all these different things? That's not what tyrant means. That's certainly not what dictator means. Although dictatorship is an arrest of political freedom of a sense, in a way. A tyrant, sorry, an archon, or like we'll just say king for simplicity's sake, because I don't have this thing before me. Actually, I have. When I was going through this, I actually just did my own little like horribly scrawled lexicon in the back, so I have my own dictionary here. But very rudimentary dictionary. A king was somebody who ruled by religious right. He was the first of a leading family, and he was religiously ordained, what we would call religiously ordained, with like, bird signs, yada yada yada. He was basically a priest king. A tyrant, by contrast, was somebody who ruled through power. So, very often overwhelmingly, they were nobles who were displeased with the current rulership and made promises to lower classes in order to take power by force. And all of the reforming moves towards democracy in ancient Athens were done by tyrants and or lawgivers that were assigned as a kind of a third position in a different sense, as an outside stance, kind of like an artificially arranged outsider perspective to like fix things from the outside without bias in favor of any particular class, with the aim to stabilizing the community itself. So when we're talking about the changing of legitimate power into arbitrary power, in connection with the abstraction of sort of property into law, or of laws into the kind of thing that needed somebody to know and then to govern according to them, there is a direct connection between these two. So this isn't actually in itself strange. I think, yeah. Now this is where, okay, I'll just finish that thought and then we'll move on to the second half of this. So, I'm just so distracted by the bottom half of this paragraph, but I'll have to finish up here quickly. So yeah, the changing of legitimate power into arbitrary power, as you have a community established that is separate, independent from the religiously ordained community that prevailed prior, you do have the move from legitimate power, quote unquote, into arbitrary power, which is literally just we can think of that as not arbitrary in the sense of despotic and cruel and without reason, but arbitrary in the sense of an arbiter, somebody who makes decisions, of decisionistic power. So the emergence effectively of sovereignty, because legitimate power in this context is tribal power. It is cultic tribal power. Arbitrary power, by contrast, is the result of what would later be described in effectively contractarian terms. So, when the tyrants broke up the power of the tribes in Athens, just as one example, the daimois that resulted, they identified more with the community as a whole than they did with any of these particular tribes, because their interests were tied to a geographically defined region, not to a faction bound by blood. So you had arbitrary power, sort of decisionistic and abstractly arising power, that arises specifically from the relations of these different units of this abstraction called the community. You had the emergence of that out of legitimate power by arbitrary decisions. That's crucial. Now he goes on to say, de Maistre, I mean, from which it follows incontestably that the subjects of the antique sovereigns of Asia, those monarch gods, he's thinking of course, the Persian kings, first and foremost, those monarch gods whose wills were oracles were much better governed than the Spartans or the Romans at the time of Cincinnatus, since they were nearer the origins of things. I don't think this follows at all. This would not be consistent with Rousseau's thought in any case. Because nearer the origin of things, we're like talking about different levels of progression towards a bad. We're not talking about like degrees of worsening per se. We are talking about sort of a total changing of the state of the human species. So like the inequality of a slave of the Persian king apropos, satraps, and then satraps apropos the king, that isn't better than the inequality of post-reform Athens, or democratic Athens rather. Sorry, I'm fighting hiccups here, which is why I'm constantly gulping. Or that the Spartans and other republicans of later times did not have a legitimate government because they arrived after the third epoch. When one refutes Rousseau, it is less a question of proving that he is wrong than proving that he does not know what he wants to prove, which is what happens especially in his discourse on the inequality of conditions. Broadly speaking, he maintains that society is bad and that man is not made for this state. But if you ask him what state he was made for, then he knows not what to reply, or he replies without understanding himself. I think this is a misreading on de Maistre's part. We'll take for granted that Rousseau characterizes society as bad. He definitely is trying to explain evils in the society in which he lived, or in societies existing while he lived. But the opposite of man not being made for the state is not that man is made for another state. In fact, I think one of the major implications of Rousseau's historical approach is that man isn't made for anything. He is simply made by things. By things in history. You can really start to see the influence Rousseau had on Hegel and Kant here. So I think this is just a flat-out misunderstanding by de Maistre. I don't think Rousseau is committed to invoking some other ideal state in order to say that, again, the state in which we now live is contrary to sort of human nature in a simple sense. Like, if we're talking about the distinction between, or rather, the ill-fittedness of an exploitative modern society with an animal species, which we are, which is different, by the way, from saying beast. People often are confused when people say that, equivocate between human beings and animals, as if they're saying, well, we have equal worth to, like, slugs and whatnot. No, that's not what that means. It's literally just referring to the fact that we share a biological heritage with other animals, obviously, and of course to the obvious point that we move, we are animated. Yeah, so like we didn't evolve into we didn't evolve through like natural selection or through we aren't biologically fitted to sort of a modern industrial property society. Some of us are more comfortable in that, but we aren't made for that. And more to the point, to be more consistent with Rousseau, we aren't really conditioned for that temperamentally or biologically or all these other things. So that even if you're very, very wealthy, you can be extraordinarily unhealthy, both psychologically and physically, in a modern context. Right. All things examined, he decides for the beginnings. He decides for the beginning. That's a weird sentence. All things examined, he decides for the beginnings of society. Then he says, the relations already established among men required in them qualities different from their primitive constitution. That morality beginning to be introduced into human actions. That morality beginning to be introduced into human actions, and each man prior to laws being sole judge and avenger of the offenses he had received. The goodness suitable for the pure state of nature was no longer that which suited nascent society. It was up to the terror of revenge to take the place of the restraint of laws. The state where men lived together but without laws, and where the terror of revenge took the place of the restraint of the laws, is the best possible state, according to Rousseau. I don't think that's true. The relations already established among men required in them qualities different from their primitive constitution. Yeah, exactly what I was saying earlier. That morality beginning to be introduced into human actions, and each man prior to laws being sole judge and avenger of the offenses he had received, the goodness suitable for the pure state of nature was no longer that which suited nascent society. It was up to the terror of revenge to take the place of the restraint of laws. Yeah, this is effectively okay. So crucially, okay. So this is what so. The language here sounds bad until you think about it a little bit. It was up to the terror of revenge to take the place of the restraint of laws. This is the terror of revenge causing restraint. This isn't sort of the ubiquitous, this isn't a state of war in which there are just acts of revenge everywhere. We're all just killing each other, stealing stuff, getting murdered on the way out the back door, things like that. The terror of revenge restrains like laws do. So there is no revenge, or there's little revenge, because people are careful to avoid incurring it. So I mean, this is the best possible state according to Rousseau. Yeah, because I mean, he's contradicting Hobbes. Because he's trying to say, well, no, there's stability in this state of nature prior to some sovereign to hold us all in awe, and to our contracts. Let's get the coffee out of the way. Because one of the reasons why we need to escape the state of nature in Hobbes is that we need to escape a situation in which we cannot build or what have you, or we can't grow in complexity or stability because we constantly have to fear attack from all sides, from people we have no concrete reason to trust or feel safe from. But what Rousseau points out is that, well, actually, we are of disposition sort of inclined to get along, again, prior to the case of extreme inequality that makes us covet desperately the belongings of other people. So, we are sort of social animals. We are sort of naturally disposed to feel like empathy and to communicate with like kin groups and things like that. So there actually is a case for stability in the state of nature. It's not necessarily a state of war per se. Hobbes projects the modern socialized human being back into nature and finds that they are brutal monsters in nature without laws. Rousseau argues that human beings in the state of nature prior to being socialized into modernity or into an unequal society are a different animal entirely. Not in the sense of a different species, but we're different. We have an entirely different disposition towards each other. The more one thinks about it, the more one finds that this state was the least subject to revolutions, the best for man, and that he must have come out of it only by some fatal accident, which, for the common utility, ought never to have happened. The example of savages who have almost all have been found at this point, seems to confirm that the human race was made to remain in it always. That this state is the veritable youth of the world, and that all subsequent progress has been in appearance so many steps towards the perfection of the individual. Oh, I see. And that all subsequent progress has been in appearance so many steps toward the perfection of the individual, but in fact toward the decrepitude of the species. Certainly there is nothing reasonable in this piece, but at least it seems that the ideas are clear and that Rousseau is displaying. This is, by the way, where the noble savage idea comes from. Now, I believe Rousseau actually qualifies this a little bit, because, of course, indigenous Americans have history too, and they have complex societies and even forms of land ownership that aren't the same kind of land ownership that evolved in Europe, but there are similarities you can make. There are territories, there are all these different stratifications. We aren't actually talking about a society in the state of nature at all. We are talking about, or people in the state of nature. We are talking about communities with their own history. It's just, especially when you're approaching it from the vantage of extreme technological and cultural chauvinism, that tends to blur. Rousseau wasn't really woke on this, so to speak, but he did recognize that there was history there. Certainly there is nothing reasonable in this piece, but at least it seems that the ideas are clear and that Rousseau is displaying a fixed system. Okay, so he's got a... This is a bit of a strange juxtaposition. So he says there's nothing reasonable in the piece, but Rousseau is displaying a fixed system. A fixed system would seem to imply that there are persistent reasons for things, right? So I don't see how we can say that there's nothing reasonable in this. There's so much of this is just like unnecessary acid that doesn't add to this, especially since like he seems to have a very weak grasp of Rousseau. I think de Maistre's a bit of a victim of his own contempt for Rousseau. Do you really need to have respect for a thing when you're trying to criticize it? Which is different from having, like, crucially, it is possible that someone's account of a thing is very bad, and it could even result from flaws in a person's character, like I just indicated here with his contempt, with de Maistre's contempt for Rousseau. But if on first brush you're not willing to approach it as if he's saying something serious, you're not like willing to dig, because you think automatically that it's stupid for some reason, then you're not going to do a good job, which he doesn't seem to be doing here. Everywhere he speaks with favor of savages, in his opinion, they are very well governed. It is from among them that he chooses all his examples. He insists on this great argument in more than one place. We see Europeans embrace the life of savages while we have never seen a savage embrace ours. I don't know what he's talking about here. This proves at most that it is easier to find a brute among men than a man among brutes. He tells the true or false story of a Hottentot raised in... Is it Hottentot? Hottentot? Raised in our religion and in our customs, and who, tired of all these abuses, returned to his equals. He engraved that history on the frontispiece of this work, and in a note to which there is not a word of rejoinder, he tells us to see the frontispiece. So we could believe that Rousseau had clearly decided for the state of the savages, and nevertheless we would be mistaken. 2 pages previously he had refuted himself. What? Hang on. I don't know what he's referring to. De Maistre would be better if he cut out all the proving Rousseau wrong and concentrated on explaining what is right. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why De Maistre isn't really read seriously. I mean, he is read, but largely as sort of in the history of reactionary thinking, and not so much for the actual value of his thought. This is sterile. There's nowhere to go. We'll see what he has to say when we come to sovereignty and whatnot, but there's not a whole lot of particular interest here for itself. It is interesting to see how he receives Rousseau, but so far, like, given what I've read, I'm not blown away. If only De Maistre had had an uncomfortably buff anthropomorphic wolf avatar with unrealistically large muscles and a French flag tank top, then more people would have taken him seriously. Yeah, right. Would De Maistre have a Greek statue avatar for his YouTube channel? I think De Maistre would have like a black and white low resolution picture of Charlemagne in all likelihood. All right. Now for the roller coaster of racism. Every moral and sensitive man is revolted by the brutality and cruelty of these American savages whose happy existence Rousseau dares praise to us. Hordes of brutalized men wandering in the deserts, almost without moral ideas and without knowledge of the divinity, having all the vices except those whose materials they lack. Well, vices except those whose materials they lack. This is an argument in favor of Rousseau even from De Maistre's Christian chauvinistic position. Again, like, I don't know. Because I believe De Maistre was a literalist when it came to the book of Genesis, right? I think I've vaguely heard that. If that's correct, hordes of brutalized men wandering in the deserts without moral ideas, without knowledge of the divinity. He's talking about Adam. Having all the vices except those whose materials they lack, interminable and bloody wars, the tomahawk, bloody scalpings, death chants, human flesh served at frightful meals. This is just ridiculous. Prisoners of war roasted, mangled, tormented in the most horrible way. I mean, there definitely were violent practices, but they didn't draw and quarter people. We burned people at the stake. Cortez wasn't an American native. Was he a Protestant Christian or a Catholic Christian? I believe de Maistre was Catholic. He would have had to have been a Catholic, no? I could be wrong on that. I thought he was a Catholic. He has a thing on the Pope, I believe. Again, I'm not a Rousseau scholar either, but I'm not a de Maistre scholar. Such frightful pictures, Rousseau feels it, and here is how he meets the objection. It is for want, he says, of having sufficiently distinguished between ideas, and noticed how far these peoples already were from the state of nature, that many have hastened to conclude that man is naturally cruel, and that he needs civilization in order to make him gentler. Yeah, exactly. The savage is therefore very far from the first state of nature. There are therefore several states of nature, which appears singular enough. But finally, which is the good one? For this must be decided. Rousseau replies, it is the primitive state, and nothing is so gentle as man in his primitive state, when he is placed by nature at equal distances from the stupidity of brutes and the fatal enlightenment of civil man. Yeah, so if you have a small number of human beings in an environment in which there is enough for them to go around, in which access to mates and food and shelter is, for whatever reason, not hoarded. So, I mean, Rousseau should appeal to incels, I suppose. He was definitely not that, unfortunately. Then human beings have, on his view of human nature, no reason to come to vicious conflict with each other. When we're talking about even like let's take this horrible caricature of who exactly, I'm not entirely sure, but like these bloody violent bands roaming the deserts. These are communities with a deep history in this position of in a cramped situation of scarcity and of competition with other groups. So that's not the state of nature. That's certainly not a state of nature you would want to imitate, if indeed it is a state of nature. I don't think I would characterize that as a state of nature. That's a complex society that has historically evolved to a place that we don't want to be. But of course, it also goes without saying that this is a ridiculous caricature of how most native cultures were. And indeed, a lot of the to memory, most of the cultures in which any of this applied, these would have been very landed cultures. The Aztecs, for example, were not nomads. They were not in the state of nature in any way, shape, or form. Super complicated, super complex, and sophisticated social systems. I don't like that term, but we'll say that for now. Social systems, and they also happen to be religiously inclined to brutalize all of the neighboring tribes, which is why Cortez found so much support against the Aztecs. Goodness, the pollen is just causing my throat to swell. This is awful. This is why I don't tend to do crazy long streams. The state of the savage is therefore no longer a proportional mean between animality and civilization, and this proportional mean must be looked for between the state of animality and that of the savage. Yeah, okay, that's right. It's there isn't like a strict genealogy of positive development between in which nomadic peoples or native tribes in North America. There isn't a trajectory in which these are simply like a developmental stage. Our history is particular, including theirs. It's equal in terms of time and development to ours in a very basic sense. Obviously, there are again technical achievements that are not mirrored in both cases. I don't think anybody would argue that Native Americans were equivalent in from the sense of command of material. However, the argument here is precisely that this isn't, strictly speaking, a positive evolution, the ability to command immense amounts of material in the world, because this, again, depends upon a social arrangement which is bad for us. That's Rousseau's argument. However, how is a man much less civilized than a savage nevertheless placed at equal distances from the stupidity of brutes and the fatal enlightenment of civil man, of Newton, for example, or any other degraded being? How can such a state be at the same time intermediate and primitive? Hang on. At equal distances from the stupidity of brutes. Yeah, so he's talking about still communities of people, Rousseau is, but he's talking about something that isn't sort of living in kind of like a mute animal state. How can such a state be at the same time intermediate and primitive? In other words, how can the first state of nature be only the second? Oh, I see. Oh, so not... Yeah, okay. How can the first state of nature be only the second? Well, is the stupidity of brutes the state of nature of man? I think would be the point. I'm going to have to return again to Rousseau and come back to this, but that's my immediate thought. If he's talking about we don't behave like non-human animals do, and yet it is still the first state of nature for human beings. So, like, from an evolutionary standpoint, we would look at, like, the state of nature for human beings wouldn't precede a state of affairs in which human beings didn't yet exist. Does that make sense? If the savage life is the youth of the world, and if men were meant to remain in this state, how did nature make men for a state where vengeance became terrible and men bloodthirsty and cruel? Instead of designing him for the primitive state, which is the second, where nothing is so gentle as man. Well, hang on. That's a relative statement. Nothing is so gentle as man, right? So it may be... There's a note here. Maybe this goes into some... No, it doesn't. So... Maybe... sort of like how we have a natural tendency towards empathy and things like that. Insofar as we do find ourselves annoyed or wanting something that is in somebody's immediate possession. Not from desperation on our end, but just because maybe they found like a really nice looking fruit, or they had a really attractive mate, or they had a really pleasant looking dwelling, yada yada yada. Or we just didn't like their face, maybe, I don't know. Maybe we intuit that if we, like, we're also naturally intimidated by other people's physical power. So we don't take or all these other things by a natural instinct for our self-preservation. So we still fear vengeance, but we don't necessarily need the example of vengeance in our lives in order to be restrained as if by law. This is not all, however. Let us bring the two following passages together. Nothing is more provocative. Savage peoples, he says, already were far from the state of nature, where man is placed by nature at equal distances from the stupidity of brutes and the fatal enlightenment of civil man. In the beginnings of society, it was up to the terror of revenge to take the place of the restraint of law. The example of the savages, who have almost all been found at this point, shows us the development of human faculties maintaining a golden mean between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of our amour propre. Thus, this happy intermediate state is found and is not found in the savage state. Almost all savage people are to be found at this point, but it is from lack of attention that many have not seen how far these peoples already were from the first state of nature. Yeah, so I suppose insofar as, again, like certain relations of property and whatnot haven't been instituted, you would still see some holdovers. So it's not so much, again, that there... so you can lose elements of... So the loss of natural relations comes about through a kind of technological development. So that makes sense. Once again, it is not a question of proving that Rousseau is wrong. For to be wrong, one must affirm something. He has affirmed something, so this is kind of silly. I don't know why he's forcing the critical approach so hard here. It's a little bit... It's really off-putting. Like, this kind of reads like he would find his audience on YouTube, that is for sure. It is not a matter of proving that Rousseau is wrong, but of proving that he does not know what he wants to prove, that he has neither a plan nor a system. He just said he has a system. That he worked in fits and starts, as he said himself, perhaps without believing it. Did he say that? In his notice on the notes that he placed at the beginning of the discourse, Rousseau wrote, "I have added some notes to this work, following my lazy custom of working in fits and starts." Yeah, but that's not... that's not referring to his thought, though. That refers to his... That refers to the actual process of writing. As he said himself, perhaps without believing it, and that all his philosophical compositions are only pieced and tattered rags, often precious taken individually, but always detestable taken together. In felix operis summa quia ponere totum nescit. I have almost definitely butchered that pronunciation, but it's a quote from Horace, apparently. He is unhappy with the total result because he cannot represent a whole figure. Okay? And here we have some lines. What is this? 3 blank pages. Okay. Talking about working in fits and starts, he immediately 3 pages disappear. I don't know if that's because these pages are lost or what. So, it might not be the Maestre's fault, but it is funny. I'm going to grab some more tea. I'll be right back. Alright, you may hear the kettle boiling in the background because I realized I didn't have any more hot water, so... We'll probably go for another half hour and then we'll call it. I just don't know how much my voice can handle. Very weak vocal cords. Alright, so... We have moved past the account of the state of nature in social terms, it appears, and we're now moving on to something a little bit different. If there is a word that has been abused, that word is nature. It is often said that a good dictionary would avoid great quarrels, so let us see what meanings can be given to the word nature. The idea of a supreme being is so natural to man, so rooted in his mind, so present in all his discourses. It is so easy to see in all the motive forces of the universe only the will of the great being. And since all these forces are in themselves only the effects of a superior force and of a primitive cause, nothing prevents us from calling them by the general name, nature. It is in this sense that a Greek father said that nature is only divine action manifested in the world. What is this from? St. John Chrysostom, cited in Gratias, De Iure Belli. And these are numbered points. 2. No theist philosopher, especially among the ancients, believed that the visible and invisible phenomena of the universe were the immediate effects of the divine will. Not everyone is truly aware of their own opinions of this subject, but if we look closely, we will find that we are generally enough led to suppose the existence of some force that acted on the world in a secondary way. Cudworth believed that it was an idea unworthy of divine majesty to make it intervene immediately in the generation of a fly, and this is what made him imagine his plastic force. It is not a question here of examining the value of this system, but one can say that it is almost general without knowing this, and that this learned Englishman only circumscribed and surrounded with argument an idea that exists under different modifications in every head. We are almost invincibly led to believe in the existence of a secondary force that operates visibly and that we call nature. We are almost invincibly led to believe in the existence of a secondary force that operates visibly and that we call nature. I don't know if that's true. A secondary force. From this belief come those expressions so common in every language, quote, nature wants, does not want, permits, forbids, loves, hates, heals, etc., unquote. In a word, this expression is so necessary that it is not possible to do without it, and at every moment we tacitly assume the existence of this force. I don't know if that's true. I think, for example, like I don't believe Physius was a god in ancient Greece, right? There were gods for elements, like water, sea creatures, the air, storms. There were dryads in the trees, yada yada yada. Animals. But these weren't together bound up with the power of a single god or force either, right? Physis simply referred to the stuff of the world. Like we translate physis into nature often, but we don't so much mean in the ancient Greek sense, and I could be wrong on this, but this seems to me from my reading, and I have some modest capacities here. It seems like they weren't invoking, in a general sense, something so obvious as like a single unified substance with its own specific dynamics. They had a very partitioned sense of, well, what we would call a partitioned sense of the world. Maybe not even that as a holistic category in some cases, and I think a lot of people today don't even have that. They live in the world, that's how we recognize it, but for them it would have been, these are just things that you encounter. They're just different things. You can do different things with these different things, and these different things do different things to you. But we're not necessarily conceiving them as being grouped, even by implication, into a single whole. That seems to me to be a distinct concept. This sort of synthesization of everything into something that can be called like a separate force that sort of permeates all things. Like nature wants, does not want, permits, forbids, loves, heals, hates, etc. I mean, I'm sure we could find quotes that seem to indicate that. But like, I don't know, let's pull something from Heraclitus. Let's see if we can't. One of the advantages of Heraclitus not being, for the most part, preserved is that we don't need to look through very much. Let's see. This is great, by the way. It's Hackett's Readings in Ancient Greek Philosophy. It comes with basically all of the pre-Socratic texts and a bunch of Aristotle and Plato as well. Okay, so from Themistius' Orations, a fragment saying nature loves to hide. Theseus loves to hide. Okay, fair enough. So that, I think, that would probably count. Human nature has no insight, but divine nature has it. This is in translation, so I'm again, like, I don't know if he's saying... I don't think that would be human feces. I could be wrong. This cosmos, the same for all, none of gods nor humans made, but it was always and is always and shall be an ever-living fire, kindled in measures and extinguished in measures. So there is a sense of a unity of all things, but I don't think... Feces as a force. That strikes me as more contingent. And crucially, like, we're looking again at the writings of a philosopher. Now, we of course know that there are things called forces in the world, and life can certainly be characterized that way. But I don't know how much we're packing into this characterization. Anyways. This statement of the obviousness of the divinity, so to speak, or these different sort of cosmological views of the world, these views of nature as being simply given in all heads, I don't think it's necessarily obvious. I mean, for God's sake, look at the history of the concept of God. It's radical paradigmatic changes over history. When we say that nature alone has closed a wound without the help of surgery, if they ask us what we mean by this expression, what do we answer? Either we speak without our understanding ourselves, or we have the idea of a force, of a power, of a principle, and to speak clearly, of a being who works for the preservation of our body and whose action was sufficient to close the wound without the help of art. Well, I mean, by implication, maybe to us that makes sense, but I don't think necessarily that an apropos elaboration on an explanation necessarily counts as even if we can derive it by implication from an expression. I don't think that's necessarily inevitable. We can definitely work without it. However, this force that acts in us acts as well in all the animals from the elephant to the mite, and in all the plants from the cedar to the moss, because nothing is isolated in the world, and nothing can exist as an independent force. Either it is necessary that all these individual principles are related to a general cause that embraces everything, and that uses them as pure instruments, or it is necessary that this great cause, this plastic nature itself, acts in all individuals in such a way that we regard particular forces only as the particular action of a general principle. Okay. Alright, so he's going to start elaborating on a very... I think I might want to come back to this in a separate episode, because I'm losing my voice, something fierce, so... But, the totality of pieces that compose the whole must have a name, and commonly enough we give it that of nature. See, that's the thing, though. The totality of pieces that compose the whole must have a name. Not necessarily. That's a thing that we choose to do, and that's a thing that we sort of have to perceive to do. Like, it may be logically inevitable if we're sort of analyzing the world, But nothing really commits us to analyze the world. It is in this sense that we say that there are no two beings in nature that resemble each other perfectly. By a completely natural analogy, we also give the name nature to the assemblage of parts or qualities that compose any whole, although this whole is itself only a part of the larger, greater whole. Thus we say the nature of man, of horses, of elephants, of gold, of silver, of linden trees, of roses, of watches, of fire engines. I don't think we use the word nature that way either. Not all the time, anyways. We don't refer to the nature to the assemblage of parts or qualities that compose any whole because, well, human beings can lack and have things additional to this. Anyways, I'm losing my voice, so I'm gonna wrap up the study here. Yeah. Maybe just talk about some updates quickly. So, of course, I'm working on, I've mentioned this before, I'm working on a video critique. It'll probably be multi-part. It'll almost certainly be multi-part. Of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. The Open Society and Its Enemies, rather. I'm hoping to arrange a debate with Perspective Philosophy on the objectivity of morality soon. I think I'm feeling about ready to do that. I've talked to a very strange person going by the name of Cheshire Cat, who apparently debated. You can tell I'm exhausted. Who apparently debated Hawes from Infrared recently. Actually, I watched that and it was ridiculous. But he wants to debate whether or not religion is required for social stability or something like that. And he's agreed to, so I'm hoping that happens too. So that'll be the first Sunday showdown that I take part in, so that'll be kind of neat. And then, of course, I'm working on a video looking at some sort of, I say logical, but I don't mean in the sense of logistical. Some problems with the concept of an Islamic State. And it primarily, I should bring on guests to co-read. That would be very smart, Robert Evans. I should absolutely have somebody on to do all the reading for me. That would be so much less tiring. You enjoyed this? Good. Yeah. Or are you getting ads? I thought I turned off ads. That's annoying. I'll turn that off when I'm done the stream. But yeah, so make a note. We are 12 pages into Against Rousseau. So we'll pick this up some other day, maybe tomorrow, maybe later, I don't know. But I kind of like this format, so maybe we'll do this more often. We'll just go till a text becomes boring, and then move on from there. But yeah, I should have guests on for these, that'd be fun. Maybe, wonder if Victor would be into that. Victor or Zan. I believe I'm going to be talking to Zan finally on Friday on his channel, so that'll be fun. But Robert Evans asks, would Native American societies today be considered underdeveloped, needing resources to fight global inequality, if they kept their culture the same, not building up industrial cities? I mean, they could be considered that way. They certainly are by certain people. But I wouldn't necessarily say underdeveloped in a teleological sense, in the sense of being, less evolved. It's more a question of, if there are things that you want to do, and it requires technology to do it, then you're committing, sort of conceptually, to a standard of development that is again, judges by the technical capacity to do the thing. So, underdeveloped in the sense that they're trying to do a thing without the technology to do it, or without the resources to do it, sure, but I wouldn't take it any farther than that. I mean, in that respect, you could say that of almost any group of people. states, for the most part, aren't tribally owned. But yeah, this is a very bad book so far. It's making some very superficial critiques. It radically misreads Rousseau in some key areas. It's doing what we would call fishing for gotchas instead of, carefully analyzing the text on its own terms. I'm curious to see where he goes with this characterization of nature as a force thing going forward. I think the next episode will be more interesting. But I mean, right off the bat, he doesn't touch Rousseau. Not even close. There's a reason why Rousseau has inspired some of the greatest philosophers of modern history, and de Maistre has, as far as I can tell, not. Because he's not engaging collaboratively with Rousseau. He's not correcting him. He's not saying, well, I think you're going wrong here. There's a logical step you're making that doesn't make sense. Here's how it might actually work. Instead, he's mocking him for the strangeness of his phrasing at times, and then making counter assertions that are underspecified, underdeveloped, rely on tropes and cliches. I mean, I'll give him this much: it's higher quality than reactionaries you see today, to be sure. He tries, he just fails. That's how I would characterize this. This is an abortive effort, but it is an effort nonetheless. So, there's value in reading this. Just the value doesn't come from de Maistre's thought. It comes from, he touches on things that are worth reflecting on. So it's clarifying in the sense of going over this and analyzing the validity of de Maistre's characterization of Rousseau, or his arguments or his counter arguments rather. It's helpful to our understanding of Rousseau and of sort of positively useful thought that develops therefrom, but it's not like, of de Maistre's, I don't think we can say we've found anything particularly useful so far. This is a ladder that you climb and you throw away, But well, we're gonna pause here. I'm gonna underline this so we know where we're starting next time. Let's watch some YouTube videos. Maybe you'll find my glasses when I go to get my tea. But yeah, let's watch some bad YouTube videos, because there were some things that I wanted to see, that I wanted to look at today. Close all tabs, yada yada yada. Here we go. Nope, that's music. No more music. We'll have a brief intermission, and then we'll go over some stuff. So we have some options here. There is Every Political Ideology Explained by Wendigoon. I have this Every Type of Government Explained. That could be interesting, by Mr. Beat. Oh god. Seeds of Collectivism. Stephen Hicks, James Lindsay, and Michael O'Fallon. What do we want? Do we want to look at Every Political Ideology Explained, or Every Type of Government Explained? I don't know if I want to do Hicks and James Lindsay. But the other videos are so long. Let's do Seeds of Collectivism. That one's recent. No. I'll tell you what. We'll put it to a vote. 1 is Every Type of Government Explained. 2 is Every Political Ideology Explained. And 3 is Seeds of Collectivism by Stephen Hicks and James Lindsay. I don't want to hear James Lindsay either. More to the point, I don't want to see James Lindsay, because I don't want to be mean or anything, but his perpetually watery-looking eyes remind me of the horrible pug mutation from that movie Evolution. It just makes me so uncomfortable to look at. So you're too uneducated to vote. You are educated by participating in a state, my friend. By voting, you educate yourself. So, every political ideology explained, or every type of government explained. Let's do 1 for every type of government, 2 for every political ideology. I'm going to get my tea, and when I come back, I will tally the votes, and we will decide. And in the meantime, let's, I'll put up the intermission, and we'll listen to some tunes. Where are we? Here we go. Sweet. And what are we going to do? Let's start here. My glasses have disappeared forever. Alright. Let's look at the votes. What are we suffering through first? Or now, I'm not doing both. God. One. Objectivist metaphysics. Maybe another time. Well. Okay, you got 10 more seconds, guys. If you want to have a vote, it's one for... What did I say? It's one for types of governments, and it's the other one for ideologies. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, you can't vote twice, Robert. All right, but you got your wish anyways because we're doing forms of government. Okay. Every type of government explained.
Hey,
Hey, shut up. It's not your turn yet. Alright, let's, That's a good face to start off on. Alright, so... Every type of government explained. It has the very great merit of being only 17 minutes long. Let's go.
hey, I'm Mr. Beat. Government, am I right? Everybody's talking about the government or complaining about the government.
I don't believe in government. I think that all government is a waste of taxpayer money.
But what is the government? Well, according to the dictionary, government means, quote, the governing body of a nation, state, or community. Wow, that's actually not that very helpful. Okay, let's consider the second definition, quote, the relation between a governed and a governing word. Okay, what the heck? Not helpful either. Okay, so here's a better definition. Government means the people who run a society. See, that wasn't that difficult. More specifically, the folks who make society's rules and actually have the power and authority to guarantee that those rules are followed. So what's politics then? Politics? That's just how the power in government is distributed. The purpose of the government is to protect society, more specifically to resolve conflicts, defend a society from other societies, or provide public services. Now, people often get really passionate about government and politics because
I hope I'm gonna eat my words and he's gonna correct this afterwards, but no. No. For a start, government as a concept, as an entity apart from, again, from the ruling classes, say, as an entity that sits aside from the people who hold offices, who are otherwise representatives of the their respective. And keeping in mind too, when we say representatives, we don't mean in the sense of, well, the ideal therefore is representative democracy, so to speak. What we mean is, in effect, their interests are those of the subdivision of the polis to which they belong. Long story short, the government isn't the people who make the rules. Specifically, it's sort of in the word government. It's an activity. It's an activity of governing. So there is obviously government in every sort of community, but is there a government? Is there an entity called government in every single community? That's not entirely clear. And no, what did he say here? What is politics? He did something really bad that I didn't like. Where is it? Let's go back a little bit. Yeah, here we go.
How the power in government is distributed.
No, politics is not how the power in government is distributed. Good God, man. No. No. If politics is about where the power in a society is distributed, then A, we couldn't talk about politics outside of a community that has this thing called society. That's one. B, we couldn't talk about politics in a society that is non-stratified. We would require there to be different power-bearing things in a society. And it wouldn't be enough to say that you have, for example, different offices. These would have to be bearers of power in and of themselves. And thirdly, it's anthropologically nonsensical. Politics has to do with that which concerns the political community. And it's... like, no. No, Mr. Beat. Yeah, he gave a dictionary definition, decided that was bad, which I agree, fair enough. But then he just makes something up. And like, yeah, sure, like, that's colloquially consistent with how people use these terms, but when you explain something, you don't just spit back at somebody the colloquial use of these terms. You either show them what they imply and therefore hit on something concrete and real, or you correct the usage. He's done neither of these things. Like you can treat politics as the division of power in a society, and then with that understanding of the term, use that word in a productive way. It wouldn't be consistent with historical usage of the word politics, but that's neither here nor there. But he says, therefore, that's what politics is. No. No. The purpose of the government is to protect society. No. We'll let him keep talking.
The purpose of the government is to protect society, more specifically to resolve conflicts, defend a society from other societies, or provide public services.
Okay. So defending a society from other societies can only be something like eugenics or religious or ideological persecution, because society doesn't mean state. So what he means is state. So he's equivocating between a society and a state. Doing exactly what Maistre did, by the way, so that's kind of funny. A government is not providing public services. Anybody can provide public services. A public service is just a service rendered to the public. There was a virtue enshrined in Aristotle called magnanimity, where... Wait, was it magnanimity? Or was it magnificence? It was magnificence. Magnanimity is sort of greatness of spirit. Magnificence was if you were wealthy, you used your wealth or deployed it towards aggrandizing the community as a whole. You would put on parades and events and feasts and things like that to boost morale and foster the unity of the city. You would donate ships. You would donate arms, stuff like that. You would put you would first of all have to be wealthy in the first place, but then, as a wealthy and private individual, which of course no citizen was, a citizen is specifically a political individual, but in your capacity as an individual, you can render a public service. Now we think of government as rendering public services in the sense of doling out social goods, but that's not exactly the same thing. And again, a government is not charged with defending a society from other societies. That's simply incorrect. For a start, we don't send the president to war, and if the entire executive branch fell, the state actually could still defend itself. Insofar as we're talking about a bordered entity whose existence is predicated on keeping out the encroachment of sort of like adversaries. Anyways, we're 1 minute in. This is not a good start.
Now, people often get really passionate about government and politics because the decisions these folks in government make on a daily basis can have a huge effect on all of a society, or even all of the societies in the world. This is also why people have different opinions about the role of government in a society, and even what the best type of government is. In this video, I will explain every major type of government, and at the end of the video, I will reveal my favorite type of government. Oh, and occasionally my friend Dr. David Miano from the channel World of Antiquity will be chiming in. Oh, there he is now. Yeah, hey.
Hey there, Mr. Beat. Thanks for inviting me into this video. I can't wait to dig into this topic with you, and I'll try to shed a little light on the ancient origins of some of these forms of government.
Let's start with two basic categories. Governments are generally either democratic or undemocratic. So our first type of government is democracy.
No, okay, so governments are always democratic. Definitionally. Why? Because unless you have a democracy, you don't have a separate entity constituted of the state as a unit. That is responsible for administration and things like that. That belongs to the servant of whatever rules, again, without the input of the demos, of the demois. So, no, democracy is not a type of government. All governments are democratic. Democratic does not refer to a type of government. It refers to a type of rule, and these are distinct. The source of power in a democracy is in the demois. The demois are the thing from which power and decision making and all that stuff comes up. It is the demois which, at whatever level of abstraction or remove, make decisions for the state. Government isn't democratic. I mean, it can be, people can be elected to positions via plebiscites, but that's not democracy. For God's sake, there's nothing stopping any monarch from holding plebiscites and letting the lower classes decide who occupies a certain position. You can have them do the same thing with monarchs. That doesn't make it democratic.
A democracy is any form of government in which the power belongs to the people and is exercised by them. The word democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning the people, and kratia, meaning rule.
Okay, yeah, the people... No. So, it's not the people rule, it's that rule comes from the people, right? And crucially, no, not the people. Not the people, the demois. The demois don't refer to individuals. Citizens are members of demois, but the demois themselves are these abstract partitions within the polis. Within the community, I should say, not strictly speaking within the physical city itself.
The people rule.
I'm going to try and calm down a little bit. I'm coming off of like an hour and a half of reading De Maistre, and this is triggering me something hard.
In other words, government exists through the consent of the people and reflects the will of the majority.
Why? Okay, so in democratic government, it reflects the will of the majority. That's not true. That's not true at all. You can elect people into government, into governmental posts, who then make decisions that do not reflect the will of the majority at all. The will of the majority could be frustrated by circumstance, even if every single member of government is fighting as hard as they can, with as faithfully towards the end of what they perceive the general will to be, or the shoot, I don't know, the people's will to be. And then government would not be reflective of the people's will.
What say you, David?
If we use a looser sense of the word democracy, we could trace its origins all the way back into prehistoric times, when tribes would make decisions through consensus by the majority of members. Sometimes this is called primitive democracy.
That's a terrible term, by the way, primitive democracy. Democracy is a technological development. It was required for certain economic goods to be procured. It was done as a means of it emerged as the indirect consequence of legal interventions to protect to keep society from, I'm using modern words again, to keep the different elements of the polis from consuming themselves and reducing the polis through civil strife. So in the case of Solon, of course, it was to stop the civil strife that was resulting from the rules of the laws of Draco, which allowed citizens to appropriate the land of poorer citizens and sell them into slavery, which is, of course, extremely bad.
Actually, with much of our decision-making today, we use primitive democracy. I mean, 5 friends get together and decide what restaurant they're going to eat at. The majority often rules.
Again, majority rule isn't democratic. Now, you often end up in a situation with democracy that the majority does in fact rule in a certain sense, or at the very least, majority wishes are represented in the in sort of the goals and endeavors of people in power in a democratic community. But this isn't democracy. This is the bare fact that you consult friends to make a decision does not make it democratic.
Right? If we're talking specifically about a fully formed governmental system, though, Athens is commonly considered the birthplace of democracy. It wasn't the only Greek city-state or polis that had democracy, but it appears to have been the first. It was developed after the overthrow of the tyrant Hippias, and devised largely by a fellow named Cleisthenes. He introduced the idea of the equality of rights for all male citizens. Any of them was free to vote and hold office. Women, slaves, foreigners, etc. were left out. But it was progressive for its time because it broke up the class system that had been firmly established in days gone by.
Okay, this is a serious misreading. Again, I don't want to be too mean, because I think these guys are earnest, and I think they do know their stuff at a low level of analysis. But this is not a critical. This isn't good. It wasn't progressive because Cleisthenes didn't institute these reforms with democracy in mind or with progress in mind. They had no concept of progress like that. There was a concept of justice, or what we translate as justice, and there was a sense that there was a good and a bad way to arrange a community. That's why people wrote politeias. But no, he broke up the old tribes into he rearranged the tribes into new tribes and divided Athens into demois to basically cut off the competition. The nobles who had the power of the tribes behind them were extremely formidable, and by cutting off the roots of their power, by breaking their monopoly on political influence, by creating this new political identity in the demois, he weakened his political opponents. As for what he envisioned being the long-term result of this, nobody can say. We have very few sources on this. But no, he didn't devise this for the sake of creating democracy. He devised this as a means to break the power of the tribes. Very different things.
Athens had a pure or direct democracy. The citizens as a group made all the decisions directly.
Okay, and there's no There is no distinction between a pure or an impure democracy. If it's impure, it's not a democracy because power is not held by the daimyos, right? What he's talking about is democracy without any form of mediation between the decisions of the citizens and the decisions of the state or of the polis, but that's not the existence of mediation. Doesn't undercut its being democratic. Every community has mediation. People were elected to offices to fulfill decisions. There are hierarchies of seniority and competence and trade and things like that. Religious hierarchies, even especially actually in Athens, even democratic Athens. And this wasn't understood as being undemocratic. This was understood as, again, like this is a technical means by which you keep the polis running. Which is more of a modern way of thinking of it, but that's effectively what it was. It was to do with it was a technology for getting things done, for making it so that the polis as a whole had the capacity to do things, to conquer territories, to grow its food, to protect itself in time of war, to arrange itself in time of in time of strife or during like plague and whatnot. Oh boy, we're going to be here for a long time, aren't we? The citizens as a group made all the decisions directly. No, the citizens as a group did not. You did not. If you were a citizen in ancient Athens, that was not sufficient to just. No.
The government leaders, the archons, were for the most part administrators who followed the will of the people.
Groovy. Thanks. The two main...
No. No, they did not. Archons were often, like the best archons were ones who directly contradicted the people. Pericles, for God's sake, he rebuked the Athenians. No, archons were in charge. Now they could be executed by vote. They were at the mercy of the daimyos in a certain sense, but no, they were the boss. They made decisions. They didn't represent the will of the people. They were elected to lead, and often they led against the people. Pericles is very famous for rebuking the people, actually. They were treated as educators and leaders. They weren't... It's not like when people vote for Trump in the United States, they're voting for their man because this guy represents my values, yada, yada, yada. He's gonna put in the stuff that I want. No. You voted for the best man who made promises, to be sure. Like, you can derive personal interest from the decision-making process in terms of who became a leader in Athens, but the leaders were not representatives of the daimyos. The leaders were the leaders.
Main forms of democracy are representative democracy and direct democracy. A direct democracy, also known as pure democracy, is where people, as the name suggests, directly vote on government decisions.
Yeah, on government decisions. But that's just democracy. We don't vote on state decisions. So, and crucially, not government decisions, state decisions. Because you can have a government that does things without your vote and still have, again, the government's power rooted in the daimyos. And you can even have citizen access to offices and to certain votes on certain decisions, but not on all decisions, clearly. Like the state runs in between plebiscites. And when a plebiscite is held, that's not up to every citizen all the time, obviously. Again, like there's just no distinction here in terms of democracy. Representative democracy basically it's not a different kind of democracy. It's just democracy by different means. So what do the daimois of America look like? It's more just the principle that, again, like, your identity is not tied to tribe, but to a geographical or something more abstract. Like we can talk about identity along lines of any sort of voluntary or legal association. But the crucial point is that it's taking you away from a traditional mode in which power is held by authorities, as it were, arising out of nature, right? Or like from time immemorial. It's not an inheritance, it's an imposition. Your identity, that is. So a daimoi is drawn on a map, and it is labeled, and it is distinguished from this daimoi. It doesn't slowly form over time by the slow expansion of a tribe and its historical relations with another tribe.
Realistically today, direct democracy works better in small communities where citizens can meet regularly to discuss new changes they want to make with their government. The first example of a direct democracy that comes to mind to me would be an industrial democracy in which workers at a workplace would make decisions about how their workplace should be run. A representative democracy is...
So workplace democracy isn't really democracy. Again, it mirrors democracy in some sense, in that the constituent parts, which have only a contractual relation with each other, have a hand in the decision-making apparatus of the corporation. But daimois, again, exceed in life their individual members. So citizens die, but the place of that citizen does not. This is why it was super important that property rights and citizens' rights were not expanded to non-Athenian families. Yeah. Because you weren't, as a citizen, you weren't just someone who was governed by the polis. You were a part of the polis. And that's very crucial. In a democracy, in properly understood, the citizen isn't a denizen. They are quite literally a part, or more accurately, the representative of a part of a polis. By the way, a new philosophy tube just dropped, and at first look it seems to be about aesthetics. Oh, okay. I don't really like philosophy tube that much. She's occasionally funny. I'm not a huge fan. I find she's usually pretty shallow.
An indirect democracy in which representatives in government vote on behalf of the people they represent. Look, we all have stuff to do. We have jobs to work at, bills to pay, chores to get done around the house, sports to play, and YouTube channels to watch. We don't have time to keep up with everything the government is up to, so we elect politicians, or people who hold or are seeking political office in government. We trust that they will vote in our best interest. This is a representative democracy, and it is by far the most common type of democracy in the world.
Okay, so the distinction... So, Aristotle characterizes a polis as being a certain community of citizens. And a citizen is defined as somebody who can hold office, who is ruled and rules in turn. Now, if you are only voting for somebody to vote, and if that person isn't actually beholden to you, well, here's what's actually happened. There is still a democracy, but you are not a citizen. You are still a part of a daimoi, but you are not a citizen. You are a denizen who has been granted certain rights, because even denizens can be granted rights. There's no contradiction there. The citizen is somebody who can and holds an office. So what you actually have, because again, the average person cannot actually hold office, cannot actually become, and by office I don't mean simply being like a functionary at a desk. You need to be in some sense in charge of something where you can make decisions and you can vote again. You live in an oligarchy. You live in a democratic oligarchy. These are not contradictory. Archy refers to who is the archon, who is the leader. Kratia refers to where power is situated and where it emerges from. So you have a democratic oligarchy in which democratic power feeds into the emergence of an oligarchic leadership. There.
Oh, it doesn't stop there. There are many, many different types of representative democracies. I won't be going through all of them, but here are a few examples until I get bored with it. The most common type of representative democracy is a republic.
Yes, but only because every state is a republic, because republic, from the Latin res publica, literally refers to the historical product of a specifically political community. A politeia is always Republican. Always. The creation of a public space, you need to have a public first. It requires the creation of the public. The public is created by the breaking up of traditional tribes into demois, which now identify more with the polis than with their tribes. And as a result of that, there is now an identity that can have a thing belonging to it. The public. Res publica. Res literally meaning thing. It is the public's thing. Insofar as you have a public, insofar as, again, you have any community form in which you have citizens that hold offices as the decision-making part of the community, you have a republic. Every state is Republican. And in fact, even if you read Machiavelli, The Prince, he divides states into principalities and republics. Well, it just so happens that the constituent parts of a principality are identical to those of a republic, and the good prince is one who basically runs in a republican fashion. It's a political community is a republic. Otherwise, you have tribal rule. You have some other type of community that is not political, that is explicitly not political, because the orientation, again, is not around the polis, not even by abstraction, as in the sense of the public space, but is around the family, or maybe even like some kind of religious organization or cult, but not the polis, and not the public space, and not the state, because the state is the ultimate extrapolation from that. So yes, this is correct. The most common type of representative democracy is a republic, but for entirely wrong reasons. Because a republic is not a type of representative democracy. A representative democracy, such as it is a type of republic.
Actually, if you look up most definitions of republic in various dictionaries, they use the words republic and phrase representative democracy interchangeably.
And stupidly. Sorry, I just had to say that.
Weirdos. But basically, a republic is any type of representative democracy where the people have a say in the executive branch, or part of the government that is supposed to carry out the laws. You want to chime in about republics, David?
Yes, the word republic is a name that comes from the Romans. It's Latin for a public thing, and they use it to refer to their governmental system. This is prior to the empire.
Yes, but why? Why do they use it to refer to their governmental system? Because the governmental system is a public thing, right? You're no longer talking about, again, the servants of a king or of an emperor or of like of a human god or something like that. You're referring to a democratically instituted administration system that belongs to, because democratic belongs to the demois, or belongs to the public. So this is he's sort of like taking a kind of vulgar modern view of the divisions of society from an internal vantage, in like the United States or Canada or the UK or something, and sort of juxtaposing that same frame backwards in time where it has no place whatsoever.
Today, we use it in a more technical sense to mean a representative democracy. And that's what the Romans had.
That's a colloquial sense. That's highly non-technical.
Instead of having the people making decisions directly, the people elected government magistrates and allowed them to make the decisions. If they didn't like what the magistrates were doing, they would elect someone else to take their place at the end of their term. The Roman Republic was led by many officials, but the consuls were at the very top. There were 2 of them, each elected for a term of 1 year. The Romans also had a Senate, which advised the government magistrates, and an assembly composed of the citizenry, which made the laws. Sometimes you'll hear about republics existing in ancient India. We don't have much documentation on this, but these governments, usually referred to as Ganasangas, were from around the time of the Buddha, and they had assemblies. We don't.
Although interestingly, the word polis has an equivalent in Sanskrit. I believe it's pronounced like pur, and it's pu, some kind of punctuation I don't understand, and r, and it again referred to a castle.
Don't know how representative these assemblies were or how elections were held, and these states were usually ruled by kings, so they probably weren't entirely representative democracies in the strict sense anyway. But a Greek historian named Diodorus, who lived in the 1st century BCE, does refer to some of the states of India as democracies. There's some question as to what he meant, because the word democracy at that time didn't have a strict definition, but it is interesting.
It had a strict definition. However, it did become associated colloquially with sort of mass rule and sort of mob rule, what we would call mob rule, because of course democracies were extremely unstable, because you had, again, many different people feeding into the decision making and being able to impinge on the decision making of the people who were put into offices, so that the polis acted erratically and recklessly. When it was not under the rule of a very charismatic and very intelligent person like Pericles. So after Pericles died, you had a bunch of people who were trying to sort of aggrandize themselves by making wide promises and engaging in extremely ambitious and dangerous ventures of conquest. And as a result, Athens ended up losing her fleet and being taken by Sparta. It's not so much that democracy was not understood to mean something technical, but rather it started to become associated with its consequences and with sort of the culture around it, right? People often, political philosophers would characterize political types not just in terms of the structure, but also in terms of the kinds of citizens it produced.
Dang, you're good. A parliamentary democracy is where the executive branch gets its power from and is held accountable to a legislature, or the part of the government that makes the laws. In this system, that legislature is actually called a parliament, thus the name parliamentary democracy. Get it? A presidential democracy is where the executive branch...
Again, I think we can boil down the problems with this video all the way just down to there is a misunderstanding with sort of like there's levels of analysis here, right? Power, government, yada yada yada, these don't all just mean whatever you want them to mean at the time. They have concrete reference in the ontology of the political community. So politics refers to, again, that which concerns the polis, or you can even say that which concerns the community as a fixture, as one. This is equivalent with republic. Republic is just a different culture's word for it, effectively. Government is an institution by that democratic power. You would actually not, that's actually redundant to say democratic power. You would simply say by that democracy, but we need to specify because we use the word democracy in a very imprecise way. is an institution, is an administrative institution put in place by that democracy to manage its affairs. And then all of these other things that we are characterizing democracy by here, like presidential democracy, parliamentary democracy, yada, 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 these are just the implementation of different social technologies. You could characterize them as technologies of, again, different governmental structures to meet the needs of a particular time and place, or to meet the needs of ruling classes or modes of production, if you want to get a little bit more modern about it. So when we're talking about all these different kinds of democracy, we're really not talking about different kinds of democracy. We're talking about different things that democracies in different times and places have done. So, yeah. And again, I feel like I'm being mean to these guys because I think they're earnest and they aren't stupid. They're just very uncritical. In like a very, in terms of like educating you in sort of the colloquial use of these terms, just as like a primer for engaging in conversation about this stuff, it's fine, whatever. But it's very bad political science.
Branch exists separately from the legislature. They have separate, distinct powers. In this system, the head of the executive branch is usually called the president. Thus, the name presidential democracy. Get it? Ha ha! I swear this stuff just makes sense, you know? Other representative democracies include demarchies, where citizens in a society are randomly selected to make government decisions on behalf of everyone else, and nonpartisan democracy, where elections...
See, look, it's even like it's literally right in front of him. Archy does not refer to the kind of state. Archy refers to who leads, who makes the decisions. So again, like if what is feeding into who occupies the archonship is exclusively the democracy, it seems to be indicated by demarchy, where it's random and it's not by decision from outside of the demos. It is the demos itself, or simply selected from the demos by nobody, by a computer maybe. Then it would be a democracy, obviously, because you have demois. It would be, well, not necessarily actually. You can't have demois that don't rule, but it would be. I'm assuming democracy would be a. Well, no, actually, I take that back a little bit. If there is a public institution that is putting people into offices from the demois, then it would be democratic. So again, it's members of the demois are the archons. The distinction's like right there. It's in the terminology. This carries through. Oh boy, we're not even halfway done. I'm gonna get some more tea. Be right back. Alright. Oh, shoot, my tea. Hang on. Okay. Let's get going.
Take place without reference to political parties. Okay, there are also semi-direct democracies in which representatives are there for day-to-day stuff, but the citizens still make the big decisions. Both direct and representative democracies have three main ways citizens make decisions: referendums, initiatives, and recalls. A referendum is simply the process in which voters either approve a new law or get rid of an old law. An initiative is a process that allows citizens to introduce new things to vote on. And finally, recalls are the process of removing the power of an elected official. Okay, so I suppose we now ought to address that other category: undemocratic governments. In undemocratic societies,
Undemocratic governments don't exist. They can't hurt you. What he's talking about are illiberal democracies.
people have no say about their government. They basically just have to go along with whatever their government does, whether they like it or not.
Yes, but from where does the government derive its power? That is the question. Democracy has nothing to do... It has nothing to do with which individuals get to make decisions. It has to do from where those from where the decision-making apparatus or authority or whatever derives its power to make effective decisions.
In these societies, leaders get to power by, other means. Any type of government where the people have no say, yet the people must obey, is called an authoritarian government.
Again, the people have no say does not mean the people, the demos, does not refer to an individual simply having absolute freedom to speak or to influence a decision. Even in a classical democracy, a direct democracy, if you will, again, there were lots of people in a household that had citizens who couldn't vote, who couldn't make decisions. Even we exclude children, right? We exclude people who are not citizens. Like there are lots of denizens in a place that may have equivalent or even more attachment to the place in which they live, who nonetheless don't get to take part personally in the decision-making process. Nonetheless, the power of the state derives from these abstract partitions along the lines of a demoi. From these abstract identities that are not tied to traditional family rule. I mean, for God's sake, like even the word Soviet, this is such a strange example.
Now let's run through those delicious types of authoritarian governments. First, there are autocracies, or governments in which power is held by one person.
Yeah, so that would be a case where you actually do have, like, in the sense of a true autocracy, in the sense of, and Mao would not be an example of this, especially Mao would not be an example of this. The entire impetus for the Cultural Revolution was strife within the party between Mao and other party members. Okay, so auto doesn't refer to auto refers to the self, so it's the power of one person. You can the power of one unit by reference to the oneness of that unit. Think of another term like autonomy, autonomy, a law unto oneself, that kind of thing. Now, if indeed one person can actually hold all of the power from themselves alone, if they can project that power such that they can make their decisions effective without that power being fed in by somewhere else, then yes, it could be an autocracy. But really, in most cases, I think in all cases, we're not talking about an autocracy. In fact, we are talking about, again, the rule of a tribe, of a small tribe maybe, but of a tribe. Xerxes didn't rule because he himself personally was just so powerful. He ruled because his family ruled, his line ruled.
The two main types of autocracies are monarchies and dictatorships.
Monarchs aren't autocratic. They are autarkic, but they're not autocratic. Dictatorships are a special case, primarily because a dictator is appointed for a state of emergency. Now, that gets a little bit tricky, because now you are indeed talking about power being situated in a state of emergency in the person of a single individual. However, that power is still nonetheless sourced from the decision of the state, or of the polis. So, or the republic.
And it really just comes down to how that one person comes to power. If the person comes to power through inheritance from a parent or another relative, it's a monarchy. This person who has all the power for life, or until they are kicked out at least, is called a monarch. Duh. Titles of monarchs are different around the world. They could be a king or queen, prince or princess, emperor or empress, archduke, duke or grand duke, emir, sultan, whatever. If the person comes to power by just taking it, often through a military takeover, then it's a dictatorship. Some dictatorships are totalitarian, which means the dictator both sets the goals and controls almost all aspects of a society.
Okay, so again, totalitarian doesn't refer to a kind of government or to a kind of state. It refers to basically a tendency. A tendency to... And again, like, the dictator both sets the goals and controls almost all aspects of a society. No, not really ever. Now, typically we associate totalitarian government with the use of secret police and things like that to keep the public in constant fear, but not necessarily controls almost all aspects of a society. There are going to be tons of things that they just don't particularly care about. People lived lives under Nazi rule, even. Now, yeah, it's somewhat of a vacuous term, I think. Especially since, like, if you were to honestly compare the culture of ancient Athens with the culture of Nazi Germany, you would probably have... You might actually have a little bit more freedom under the latter than the former, depending on who you were, in a personal level, not politically. Because these were extremely violent and vicious and brutal and controlling cultures. Like to women and minors especially, but also to public people. Again, like, famous case, Socrates was sentenced to death for atheism, and not even atheism in the sense of a concrete doctrinal position in which he denied the existence or truth or whatever of the state religion, as it were, but atheism in the sense of, you know, he behaved and spoke in a way that seemed to not hold the gods in high enough regard, and even we who, you know, don't necessarily believe in these gods ourselves, as a lot of people didn't, we are going to kill you because we deem this to be dangerous to the community or even just unpleasant. So, like when generals failed in ancient Athens, or when they did stuff that was, like, for example, Alcibiades, who defected during the Sicilian campaign, defected because he was accused by people at home of defacing a religious monument, and he probably would have been killed for it. On no evidence, of course. Democracy can be absolutely brutal, is absolutely brutal.
Hey, you know a lot about dictatorships, don't you, David? Didn't you used to be one?
I still am, in the classroom. The word dictator comes from the Romans as well. You see, when they formed their republic, some people thought that in times of crisis, such as a war, the republican system as it was might not work that well. They wanted at these times a man to be given complete and total power over the state so that quick decisions could be made. They called him a dictator, and they did use them from time to time.
It'd be more accurate to characterize a dictator as an emergency consolidation of the government in one man or under one director. A dictatorship is not a form of state.
This man had the power of life and death over everyone in the state.
But it is a form of government. So this is one of the few correct examples he's given so far.
But he would only be able to rule for 6 months. Then everything would go back to normal. Some men ended up abusing this power. Sulla and Julius Caesar, for example. The word tyrant comes from the ancient Greeks. Originally, the word had no negative connotation.
It had negative connotation. It just didn't have the negative connotation we assigned to it. Again, it was somebody who ruled against right, against the, RITE, against the proper religious ritual procedure for getting somebody into the archonship.
A tyrant was simply the name of an authoritarian ruler of a Greek city-state.
No, everybody was authoritarian in a Greek city-state. Everybody from the archon down to every single household head had especially household heads actually, had almost godlike power over their slaves and wives, and children. No, a tyrant was not an authoritarian. A tyrant was somebody who ruled without religious right. Plain and simple. He was not chosen by the tribal heads. He was perhaps not part of an established family, whatever, and typically ruled by appeal to the masses of the lower classes or of the poor or what have you, and by giving them promises and things like that. It had a positive connotation sometimes to it was simply bad. It was a negative thing to be called a tyrant. However, tyrants were often very benevolently inclined towards the lower classes and the broader mass of Polis's denizens, again, simply because they were appealing to them for their support.
They were quite popular in the Archaic period, but after the reign of Hippias of Athens, whom everybody hated, the word tyrant started to become distasteful. And that's one of the reasons why tyranny is considered a bad thing today, except in the classroom, where my word is law.
So tyrannical. I love it. Thanks, David. Now, most autocracies are really oligarchies. An oligarchy is a government in which the power is held by just a few people.
I don't like the term autocracy because I don't think it refers to anything actually concrete. A lot of monarchies are in fact also oligarchies, or are in fact oligarchies rather. Democracies can be oligarchies because, again, these suffixes identify what part of the political community these things are describing. Crassy refers to the seat of power. Archy refers to who is on top. There is really no such thing as an autocracy because no man is powerful enough to actually rule by himself or herself, as it were. It is either the rule of the family of which the supposed autocrat is simply the representative, or the instantiation is probably a better word to use. If in fact that person only rules by the whim of the rich, then it would in fact be an oligarchy, not a monarchy. Monarchy, and again, you can even have you can even mix these, right? You can have a monarchic oligarchy, or a monarchy oligarchy, a mulligarchy. If you have one person ruling by dint of being rich somehow, it wouldn't make sense concretely. Again, sort of like autocracy. The word works in abstract, but in practice, you would never actually find an autocratic government. You could, for example, find again the government situated in one person. That would be a dictatorship. But you wouldn't. That wouldn't be the seat of power. that would be the conduit of power has narrowed. It's a little bit different.
These people often have family ties, but not always, as we'll see in a bit. Throughout history, oligarchies have been the most common type of government in the world. And the fact that they are
I don't... Why is he, Okay, I don't like this. Oligarchies have been the most common type of government in the world. Who is he showing here? And why? That's a little weird, isn't it? Oligarchies have been the most common type of... Sorry, oligarchs have ruled in almost every state in history. In fact, in every political community in history. Again, because they have all of the cards. They have all of the resources that everybody else needs in order to assert themselves or to sustain themselves. Why is he specifying these people? Like, think about it. Why would he specify people who are going after capitalism in which an extraordinary amount of resources are consolidated in an extremely powerful de facto oligarchical class? This is weird. This is weird. I'm trying to think of... It would be sort of like... It would be like if he was saying that most societies have been violently illiberal, and then he showed a picture of, I don't know, John Locke or something. Like, this is... No, I mean, you could say, in fact, that this was an oligarchy, but that's beside the point.
World. And the fact that they are losing control around the world is surprisingly a pretty recent trend.
Oligarchs are not losing control around the world. Now, insofar as, like, for example, in the case of Afghanistan and Kabul, insofar as resources are simply being pulled out, yeah, some oligarchs are losing control, but at the end of the day, it's the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules.
Got anything to add about oligarchies, David?
Well, I always have something to add. Oligarchies are some of the oldest forms of government around. Aristocracies, for example, were one of the most common forms of government.
Here's a question for you. Let's assume that oligarchy is a form of government, okay? And now let's assume that democracy is also just a form of government, and simply refers to allowing people to vote on the decision-making of the state. What rule is there that says that an oligarchy cannot simply hold plebiscites and defer their decision to the common vote? Exactly nothing. So, to assign these both the category of government tells us absolutely nothing, because the category has no content. What does it mean to say that a state is oligarchic then, when it is oligarchic? What does it say that a state is oligarchic if all oligarchy means is that the rich are the government, when in fact a democratic government is... Like, you see the problem? I'm super tired, so I'm kind of fading here, but, like... There's no... The categories here are so muddled. Like, you can't act... And this is one of the reasons why people find political theory and political science so, like, bewildering when it really shouldn't be. Is because people try to force in... People want to fly before they can crawl, and before they actually do, like, the hard analysis of what are these things actually made of? What are the different levels? Where do they come from? Like, what's actually essential? What is simply, sort of colloquially attached to these things that we can sort of discard? In advance of doing that stuff, they want to start writing down laws of history. This is how power works. Yada yada yada. But they're sort of like... they end up being so underspecified. The analogy would be if you were doing medicine and you were still making reference to humors in 2021. That's basically how people like this do political science. I mean, you may as well be doing astrology.
Government in the ancient world. Sometimes they existed in harmony with monarchies and tyrannies, with the nobility sharing power.
How can you have an oligarchy living in harmony with monarchy? They are definitionally distinct. Definitionally exclusive. Monarchy means one archon. You can't have one archon and then the additional leadership of, or archonship of a bunch of a wealthy class. That doesn't make any sense. That's just it's conceptually nonsense.
Power with the state head, who himself was a noble, but other times they were formed when the nobles became discontented with single rulers and overthrew them.
Always. That's what a tyrant was.
Taking power for themselves and ruling without a king or head of state. You might think this would be an improvement, but wealthy landowners often dominated the political systems to the detriment of the poorer classes. In fact, it was resentment against this kind of government that led to the establishment of the forms of government that we were just talking about.
Wait, hang on, a tyrannical government? The monarchies ruled by religious right. The Ancien regime ruled by religious right. The English king was the head of the church. What are you talking about?
Thanks, David. I would totally have you as part of my oligarchy team. Oh, there'll be lots of different types of oligarchies as well. I also will only go over a few specific ones here. An aristocracy is ruled by the nobility, or a small class of privileged folks who claim a higher status at birth than the rest of society.
Yes, that is actually rule from the excellent. The excellent people. This would be a form of polis, not a form of government, a form of polis, aristocracy. Aristarchy or aristoarchy. What would it be? It would be aristarchy, wouldn't it? That would be the leadership of the excellent.
A plutocracy is ruled by the wealthy.
No, that's an oligarchy. A plutocracy is basically a slang term. It's not an actual form of polis or state. It's characterizing an oligarchy as undeserving of its wealth, as being basically thieves.
Keep in mind that plutocratic influence can affect any type of government. For example, in a republic, if most of the elected representatives depend on money from wealthy patrons, it's basically a plutocratic republic. A stratocracy is ruled by military leaders. A theocracy is ruled by religious leaders who rule based on their religious beliefs and values.
Sorry, not plutocracy, but I was thinking of kleptocracy, not theft, but yeah, it's just all. It would be right. So it'd be rule from wealth, specifically. Right. Okay. Sorry, I fudged that one. Plutocracy would be. I did the same thing that they're doing. Plutocracy would be if wealth occupied the status that the daimois occupy in ancient Athens. There's something sort of nonsensical about it, in that again, it'd be the yeah, that works. But it's not a form of government. It would be an oligarchy would be reflective of a plutocracy, potentially. I'll have to think about that one. Again, I'm iffy here because typically when we talk about like different kinds of, it doesn't come from an element, or it doesn't come from a non-human thing. It comes from a class of people, or from some division of human beings, or from like some family. It doesn't typically refer to, because money doesn't, like, we say like colloquially that money rules, right? Money talks, yada yada yada, but it really doesn't. Having money allows one to exert influence and power. So plutocracy, I don't know, because again, like, the power doesn't itself come from their wealth. They use their wealth. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that one when I'm less tired. This is melting my brain. Theocracy ruled by religious leaders. No. Like, look, if you were a citizen in Athens, you were a citizen by religious right. The archons were also priests. You were... No, theocracy, insofar as that's even a viable concept, and I really don't think it is, because I don't think, again, these terms are distinguished enough. A theocracy would be ruled by God, or else it's not a theocracy. Now, you could try and posture the rule of some cult as a theocracy by asserting that they are the representatives of God, and therefore their rule is effectively the rule of God, or at the very least, or power is rather channeled from God. But theocracy is not really. I don't take that seriously as a category. There's a reason why you won't actually find it in a lot of in much serious political analysis at all, and if you do, it's not really heavily analyzed, sort of being assumed again by common use. Because, like, look, when we talk about like a blank crassy, right? We're talking about from where rule derives, from where power derives. If it's ruled by religious leaders, then I'm not entirely sure what the... Is cultus Latin? I think cultus is Latin. It would be, yeah, I think it's Latin. It would be ruled by the cult, so the cultocracy, or whatever you want to say. It would not be ruled by... it would not be ruled by the theos, by God, or deocracy, right? Because God doesn't actually, as far as we are aware, doesn't rule a state. The power of a state doesn't derive from God. An actual theocracy would be the Israelites following the pillar of fire in the desert in Exodus. That would be a theocracy. Or the rule of the power of a prophet, insofar as you wanted to agree that the power of that prophet was real and derived by God. Aren't people appointed by God to rule? I don't know. I haven't asked him. Yeah, you're right, Pippa. I kind of botched that. So oligarchy is ruled by the few. It's not ruled by the wealthy. Plutocracy is... It would be plutarchy if indeed wealth somehow occupied a leadership role. But I think we're... I'm going to have to think about that one a bit more. The oligarchy thing, I botched that. I equivocated that with wealth. That was a mistake. So in effect, this video was just a rundown of colloquial and informal meanings of a bunch of political terminology that melted my brain and made me do the same thing. Yeah, it's terrible. Terrible, terrible. Let's finish this thing.
The problem with most oligarchies is that they are often just kleptocracies. A kleptocracy is a type of government in which those in power are corrupt and they're at the expense of the governed.
That could be, again, like, what is being referred to as being the site of power here? You can't be referring to an activity. Otherwise, you're not talking about a political community anymore. You're talking about, I mean, like, would you call a community living in like what is called by contract theorists a state of nature? Would you call that a naturocracy or something? No, you wouldn't. Like it's this. A lot of this stuff is it had like, I'm pretty sure it emerged as a sort of like slogans or as parts of again, as terms of disparagement and not as actual like carefully constructed and sort of logical categorizations for political types. I don't think kleptocracy actually belongs in a political typology that's serious.
You know, like spending taxpayer money on lavish mansions for themselves, stuff like that. And finally, anarchy! Anarchy just means a society with no government.
No, it doesn't. There are anarchists who insist that they want a society with no government, or they want a community with more government, if we're being more particular. But if we take the term at face value, anarchy means no kings. Means without archons. You can have a government that's anarchic. There is no contradiction there.
Throughout history, anarchy has often happened as a natural yet temporary result of a violent revolution or civil war within a country where an established government has been destroyed and a new government has yet to take its place.
On either side, in either faction, you will find an administrative body of some kind that is responsible for allocating people, material, weapons, resources, yada yada yada, and governing held territory. So, I mean, no. What you would find, however, in the case of a civil war, is anarchy in the sense that there is no decided head of the state itself. Why? Because in a civil war, the state itself, its existence is in question, or it is totally dissolved, and all that can take its place is a new state. But it's not the absence of government. This is a state of anarchy in the Hobbesian sense of, again, there is no one person of the state to hold everybody else in awe. And by the way, here's a good example of how you can have a democratic, even a democratic monarchy. What legitimates the monarchy in Hobbes, or a monarchy in Hobbes? It's not the only kind of legitimate government you could, or God, I just said that. No, it's not a form of government. What legitimates the rule of a monarch in Hobbes? Well, it's the fact that our interest leads us to enter into a covenant with each other that refers our rights to this person who represents, who thereby guards that contract and holds us all in our place. In effect, we will that monarch into their place, or we will the place of the monarch and the person of the monarch. That is itself an expression of our individual will. This is why Rousseau's general will feeds out of that, and why we get a concept of freedom going from him onwards to people like Kant and Hegel, where you're not free in a political community in the sense of being able to do whatever you want. However, you are free in being able to follow the laws that are of your own authorship. In a quite literal sense, by taking part in a political community, you gain a type of autonomy. Would you say then that anarchy is caused when the state and its administrative body is caused by a split in the ruling class? No. First of all, I don't... Like, when we're talking about anarchy in the sense of civil war, we're not really talking about anarchy in the proper sense. We're talking about anarchy as a state simply of being without kings or archons, but we aren't talking about a constitution that mandates no archon, right? So, in Hobbes' sense, he's simply referring to an absence. But you could refer to a kind of like an ethos that you're aiming towards. So, it's not just the case that there is no king because there's no... Like, what is actually absent in a case of civil war? In that kind of anarchy? Well, it's not... There's not really an absence of archons. What there is an absence of a single state for someone to be an archon over. So... This is why, again, in a case of civil war, Hobbes regards the state as having effectively died. It's not because there is no longer, leadership or government or rulers or even daimois or citizens. It's because the entity over which the archon of the state would have governed is gone. It's like asking, I suppose, where are the crewmen of a sunken ship, right? Like, everybody could survive. Everybody could survive and be fighting over scraps of wood or stuff to hold on to. And there could be a whole bunch of people basically running tiny little sea vessels all around the wreck of the ship, but there's no longer a crew of the ship. Or there's no longer a captain of the ship, except in sort of an abstract sense. Like, I be the captain of that long-forgotten vessel at the bottom of the sea. That kind of thing.
That said, there is a sizable group of anarchists out there who think governments should not exist. Many also believe that one day societies can reach a point where governments are no longer needed. Now, there are adjectives, words that we can use to describe governments to further distinguish them. We all love adjectives, except that they can make things more complicated. A big adjective used to describe governments is constitutional. If a government has a constitution that formally limits its power, it's constitutional. While representative democracies commonly have constitutions.
Just an example here. So, for example, a lot of constitutions aren't sort of written as like a single chart. They also involve like the history of the state itself or the community, right? So the Constitution of Athens, or the Politeia of Athens, is not a written set of rules. It is a description of the structure of the polis. So when we talk about the Constitution, we aren't actually... When you're talking about a Constitution as a piece of paper, you are not talking about the Constitution, because the state is not actually constituted of it. This is simply a table of laws and divisions, right? So it may describe some features of the polis, such that this contains the intellectual content of at least a part of the constitution of a state, but there's no such thing as constitutional government. That's silly. You can, first of all, because at some point the decision had to be made to implement that piece of paper. So you can have the rule of a table of laws, or rather, I don't know, have it established as law that final authority on or an articulation on some document represents the limits of decision making, the limits of what can be done by people in different offices within a political community. But that's always going to be subject to interpretation. There are going to be people there's going to be clauses, always clauses that allow for its suspension. it's not the a sheet of paper is not the constitution of a political community. It can be a very important, very useful thing to have, but it's not. Amazing how he doesn't distinguish between codified and uncodified constitutions. Okay, so crucial, yeah, that's a good point, but I would modify that a little bit. We need to be careful when we distinguish between codified and uncodified constitutions. What we really mean is that some constitutions have been in some sense codified. We do not, however, mean that an uncodified constitution is substantively different qua constitution from a codified one. They are both constitutions. The difference is that, well, the difference isn't in them. The difference is that someone has written one down and enshrined a description of the state in some respect into law, or has enshrined the rules or the laws governing a society on a piece of paper, on a document, and has called that the Constitution as a way of, frankly, superfluously boosting its prestige, right? You say, like, this piece of paper is the state. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's not.
Constitutions. Did you know some monarchies do too? Yep. There are constitutional monarchies in which the monarch's powers are limited by a constitution. At this point in the video, I have probably made a lot of political science dorks upset, so I will wrap things up by stressing that I have really simplified
Okay, he got me there.
government types for the sake of clarity in this video.
No, you you obfuscated and equivocated between government, power, the ontology of the state, sovereignty, all these different things for the sake of ease. You have obfuscated. You have not clarified anything at all. This has been a massively misleading video, in ways that frankly nobody cares about. So.
You see, every government is unique, and often a society's government is a combination of different governments with weird qualifiers and caveats. Take my home country, for example, the United States. I've always taught my American government students that the United States is a representative democracy. Oh, and a republic. Oh, and a constitutional republic. Oh, and a democratic republic.
Okay, so think of all the different hats you have to wear for these to apply. In technical sense, yes, the United States is a republic. However, when you say that the United States is a republic as opposed to simply being a democracy, you aren't even speaking as the same kind of person anymore. You're no longer talking about the same kind of thing. You're saying that, oh, it's a democracy. But, of course, it's complicated by a bunch of institutional, like, things that keep the demos acting in certain ways and through certain conduits. Except that you are, again, not even talking about democracy in that sense either anymore, because democracies always had those conduits and institutions. Because that's how they came together and functioned. And then you say it's a constitutional republic. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you enshrine all of these functional systems on a piece of paper. We're not talking about constitution in the sense of an actual constitution or republic in the sense of an actual republic anymore. And then when you say democratic republic, you're not even talking about either of those things. Now you're just talking about the republic in the latter sense that happens to have a liberal culture about it. There's a general tendency, hardly a universal, hardly the rule, but a general tendency to allowing people to say and think what they want, except when they can't. And then representative democracy. Well, we don't really mean democracy anymore, and we barely mean representative, and we've lost entirely our points of reference.
So yeah, I just really like to confuse my students, and I guess I like to confuse you too. And now the moment some of you have been waiting for, I will finally reveal my favorite type of government. Drum roll, please.
His favorite type of government may as well be drum roll, please.
Drum roll.
Oh, it is drum roll. Okay, called it. Beautiful. I love that kind of government. A drum roll.
My favorite type of government is a republic.
Which is not a type of government.
But more specifically, a parliamentary form of nonpartisan democracy. Basically have a parliament where we elect members of this parliament, but we do so without reference to political parties. Booyah! So do you agree with me? If you don't, let me know in the comments why you have an incorrect opinion. Also, a special thank you to my friend Dr. David Miano from the channel World of Antiquity for chiming in throughout this video.
Well, thanks for having me.
Sure thing. Be sure to check out.
No, I don't think we will. Alright, enough of that. I think we're about 3 hours in, so, dear God. I remember that not being that bad, but it was that bad. Well, we saw the abyss today. Thanks everybody for watching. I'm gonna go outside into nature and forget all this exists. Take care.